Looks like we are live on a number of different platforms right now. So, all right, welcome to Talking Christianity Apologetics. My name is Josh Gibbs, and today we're going to be talking about Text and Canon once again. The guest that we've got coming on today is Jonathan Sheffield, so I've really been looking forward to this conversation. It's been a long time coming. He and I have gone back and forth for a few months on this particular topic, and I find myself in agreement in a lot of places with Jonathan, and I think that he comes about this conversation from another angle that you may or may not have considered or heard before. So this is definitely going to be worth your time to take a listen to what he's got to say. So if you get a chance, make sure that you share this with your friends, and if you want to start a watch party, obviously you can do that as well. But stay with us and we'll be right back.
Make sure today that you leave this place knowing that you are saved to the glory of God.
Thinks that one I'm going to choose. If you believe that, friends, you don't know the gospel.
Is that the wonder of the cross is that no one gets injustice. If you end up under the wrath of God, it is because you've rejected His provision for you, and you are justly punished for your sin.
To what the Scriptures teach. I think the Bible does teach that God desires the salvation of all men, and He has provided for the salvation of all men. And therefore, anyone who ends up under the wrath of God, it is because they have rejected His provision for them, and they are justly punished for their sins.
The question that seeks to provide an answer to this question: for whose sins did Jesus die? The extent of the atonement asks the question, for whose sins did Jesus die? There are only two possible answers to that question. Either Jesus died for the sins of some people, or Jesus died for the sins of all people.
All right, welcome back, and I'm going to get Jonathan on with us so that you can see him on the video as well. So it looks like we've got you on. Jonathan, hey, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been a long time coming, so we're finally here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on your channel. I've been looking forward to the conversation as well.
Yeah, this is going to be good. I mean, you and I you actually sent me an outline for kind of some of the talking points that we've discussed in the past and some things that really need to be brought up based off some of the different conversations that you've had in this particular area with different text scholars and other people when it comes to the methodologies used in determining which text is, in fact, the Word of God. So I think that there's a lot of different places that we can start, but let's start by just giving an introduction for yourself, who you are, where people can get access to some of the different things that you've done, and then we'll pick it up from there and jump right in. So.
Okay, well, my name is Jonathan Sheffield. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, now living in San Antonio. And over the last several years, I've sort of created a new genre in apologetics by putting them to 2D and 3D animations, actually defending the reliability of the New Testament. And over the course of these last few years, I've been able to have very valuable discussions with Dr. Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Richard Price, and other text critics in the area as we continue to pursue this discussion on what are the official texts of the apostles.
Awesome.
You can
Yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, yeah, no. Anyone can find me on YouTube at my channel, Jonathan Sheffield, where I have all my animations, and on Twitter and Facebook as well.
Sweet. So let me share that with you guys who are watching online or viewing in live with us right now. Wrong screen. You should be able to, well, let me get over here to his YouTube channel. So if you just go to search Jonathan Sheffield, this is kind of an example of what his YouTube page looks like, and then all the different videos which that I think my favorite would be the James White Halloween special. That's really good. But then the conversation that you broke down into different parts with between Bart Ehrman and just a bunch of different conversations that you've had. It's really good. So go check that out if you haven't seen that already. And let me cut back to our scene here. Oops, what happened there? Okay, yeah, that's it. Okay, so should have that back. But yeah, go check that out, guys. And so let's just... I wanted to tell you also, before I forget, I'm a little scatterbrained right now, but anyways, for those of you who are watching live, we are going to open it up to questions for those for you at the end. If you would like to call in and ask Jonathan a question or kind of challenge something that you think that he says that may or may not be correct or incorrect, so you can do that. The number for that is going to be 816-866-0025, and I'm going to put that up on the screen as well. So 816-866-0025. And we'll give you a chance at the end there for any of you who do view live to call in if you want to. So, all right, hey, let's go ahead and jump in with kind of the opening point for our conversation today, which I was saying earlier before we went live that I think this is a really good place to start in having the conversation that we're going to have today, and we'll see how much ground that we can cover from there. But the first kind of point in this conversation starts with this question: are the ecclesiastical texts secondary in origin? So that would be Byzantium, the Vulgate of Jerome, and the Peshitta. And then I'll just get your take on it, and if something comes up that I think of, I'll chime in and see if we can carry the conversation along from there.
Okay. Well, I think I wanted to start off with the conclusion that is held by the majority of modern textual scholars that is based in the German rationalism. So when we talk about the ecclesiastical text, as Josh pointed out, we're talking about the Syrian Byzantium text form, the Vulgate of Jerome, and the Peshitta as the foundational texts that have been ecclesiastically transmitted down through history through the churches. Now, in terms of value, because here we're talking about the majority of documents that have come down from the churches. So in terms of value, Dr. Gurry kind of points out that the Byzantine manuscripts have been disparaged by the majority of New Testament textual critics as the least valuable for recovering the original text when considered as a whole. Birdsall kind of states that the Byzantine manuscripts are inferior, and when we're talking about modern textual scholars like Dr. Gurry, Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Elijah Hickson, James White, Daniel Wallace, the working presumption that Maurice Robinson says is that the vast bulk of our New Testament manuscripts are excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text. And even Dr. Gurry kind of chides James White and Daniel Wallace for appealing to the ecclesiastical text for recovering the text in the New Testament when they don't actually use it. So when we talk about the origin or their secondary in origin, it basically means that they're inferior, they're not valuable. So when we're establishing a textual addition, these texts are not regarded as having any real value in determining the original. So their primary conclusion is that these texts are secondary in origin, and our goal is to restore the text to the closer representatives to what the churches were actually using.
So it seems like that would be kind of the source of the conversation for what the purpose of text criticism would be. Is it to get back to the original, as in using text critical methodologies to get as close to the original as we can, or is it to discover the original in some manuscript that this would be the manuscript that the originals were in? What's kind of the purpose in text criticism itself, and then we'll get to deciding how we get to the position to decide whether or not it would be secondary in origin in this particular text type. So where do you want to go with that side of the conversation?
Well, let's understand the problem. Where do they get this idea that the church text or the ecclesiastical text are secondary in origin? Now, Aaron does a good piece on this in establishing that the earliest surviving manuscripts, when we talk about Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, P75, P66, those documents have a text different than the ecclesiastical text, and the thought there is, if these texts are earlier, aren't they most likely original, and wouldn't they then represent the type of text used by the Greek Orthodox churches earlier? So the problem is twofold. We have basically two different texts that we are looking at, and which one of these text forms are closer to the original. So this is where they sort of draw their conclusion that the church, there must have been some sort of interruption in the church to get them to move away from the original text and get them to a point where the texts that have come down moved away and evolved from the original form of the text. So their discussion for recovering it is to get back to the earliest form of the text as represented by the official Greek Orthodox churches.
Okay, so let's define what an ecclesiastical text is, because you'll hear often, if you listen to guys like James White would say that he's never seen an ecclesiastical text. I mean, what text did the church ever actually officially adopt, and where can I find it? That kind of thing. When we're defining what the ecclesiastical text would be, I mean, obviously there's there's a lot of different angles coming in from there, but what would your response be to a question like that?
Well, I mean, when we say ecclesiastical, we say the church text, and we go from there. Well, what churches? Well, we could start off with Antioch. The thing about Antioch is we're coming into the 4th century. Antioch is the earliest surviving Greek church, going back to the Apostle Peter. And in the 4th century, when Chrysostom is preaching publicly from the scriptures, it's really the first time in history that we can see the type of texts that were publicly preached to the congregations from one of the elders in the church, from the oldest church going back. So that form of the text, even though it's not exactly the same type of text that we see coming down in the Greek Orthodox churches, we see that form of the text coming down through the Greek Orthodox churches. So when we say the ecclesiastical text, the text that was publicly preached and handed down by the official churches, in this case, the Greek Orthodox. Now, when we talk about in the West, the text that was handed down, we can see in the churches that are coming out from the official churches. When we talk about Rome, out in North Africa, we have the Vulgate. The Vulgate was the official text of a number of the Western churches, especially of Rome, that has come down historically to us through the Western churches. It was used in North Africa, so it was the text that was publicly read to the congregation or the people, the church. Yeah. So these are the texts that have been read. When we talk about the Peshitta, that is the text that, or version, that was read in the Aramaic churches that have come down through history. So what we have there in the ecclesiastical text is 3 versions of the text that were publicly read to their congregations that have come down to us.
Okay, and so the next question, and this isn't in our notes, so I'm kind of piggybacking off of this to see what your take would be. Obviously, those 3 different versions are not going to agree in every place. So we're saying these are the texts that were read in the churches. These are the texts that the church used, but they don't agree in every place. Now, this would be kind of where the idea where text criticism would come into play in deciding what text are we going to use to make the versions that we get today. So. How would you respond when we're saying that this was the ecclesiastical text, when we know that they didn't all agree in all places, and there's just certain things that are different about them? So, what would your response be there?
Well, first we have 3. The variants between the ecclesiastical text show that they were independent. So there was not one authority that forced a standardized edition upon the text of the apostolic churches. So we have 3 different texts or witnesses to the text that they received and handed down. So this really becomes the issue when Valor actually looks at the Greek and the Latin Vulgate and notices that there are differences. I think it's important that when the Turks invaded Constantinople, we had a number of Greeks fleeing Constantinople and coming in through Venice and into Europe and bringing their texts. And Valor was one of the first to notice that there are differences between the Latin text, or the Vulgate, and the text of the Greek Orthodox. And so what begins to happen here is both Cardinal Jimenez and Erasmus, who was very much influenced by the work of Valla, they start working on to resolve the differences in the Latin Vulgate and in the text of the Greek Orthodox Church. So their additions is representing the textual basis for how do you resolve those differences. And what comes out of that is the TR. So the TR represents the decision points on resolving the differences between the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic texts.
Perfect. So we're going to talk about kind of the differences of the methodologies used to determine what that text would be between the TR and the critical text. But we've got a long way to go before we get there to come to an end goal on that side of the conversation. But you've got a quote here in the notes that you sent me that say this, quote, "The Byzantine manuscripts have been disparaged by a majority of New Testament text critics at the least valuable for recovering the original text when considered as a whole." And you go on to talk about where Birdsall states that the Byzantine manuscripts are inferior. Do you want to talk about those 2 points a little bit and tie in to where Maurice Robinson has his perspective on the eclectic scholars?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand their foundation. So they're looking at the manuscript evidence and they're saying what's valuable and what's not as the basis for our edition. Now, when we talk about Dr. Peters Gurry's statement that a vast majority of the New Testament scholars say that the Byzantium is probably the least valuable, what they're talking about is their premise that there was an interruption at some point in the church that got the churches to move away from the original text and produce the type of text that's illustrated in the Byzantium text form. And, this really begins with Hort, because one of Hort's premises was, well, we can't trust the Byzantium text form because our premise is that either Lucan of Antioch created a new text at Antioch that he then forced upon the Church of Antioch, which then became the basis for the text that we see in the Greek Orthodox Church. And then Rabola also made the addition of the Peshitta that we see that has come down. So because there was that interruption, what has happened is these texts are based on a common archetype. So what they say is, basically, we can't really trust these manuscripts because they are a result of a sort of revision that took place. Now, both Hort and Burkitt, as Anglicans, they understood that there was they needed a theoretical mechanism. So if these texts are secondary in origin, they need to explain how it was created, because the majority of manuscripts we're looking at exhibit this type of text. So for their premise, their argument is, well, these things happened that interrupted the original text and moved them away. Now, since that time, both of those premises have been falsified. So what modern scholars such as Ehrman, Klaus Wachtel, Gurry, and even Elijah Hickson will say is that the text of the Greek Orthodox Church is actually gradually moved over a period of time that eventually standardized this particular text. I know Ehrman gave me a quote that says he explains that the scribes were actually changing the text, sometime massively, and those changes were often copied by later scribes to become the standard text of the late Middle Ages. So it was a process. Now, Kenyon, Sir Martin Kenyon, around the time of Hort, also originally introduced that idea that this process didn't happen with Lucan or Rabola, but it actually happened over a period of time, or 1,000 years, where the churches moved to this form of the text. And because of that, we cannot trust this text because it's farther removed from the original, and you have all these changes that taken place. So it's not a viable witness as the basis for our textual edition.
Now that is a huge point, because it does seem like so often the conversation is going in that direction from a critical text position, that you can't trust the TR because of so many spurious readings that made their way in. And that term spurious is kind of a boogeyman term. It's like, man, you do not want to trust anything when it comes to the TR that we would consider to be a spurious text, or something that's untrustworthy or probably not original or inauthentic. But the whole idea that there was a corruption in the beginning that made its way into the Byzantine majority text form is kind of a big deal. Like, honestly, that's a huge claim. I mean, because if there is some sort of corruption that made its way in, and the majority of these manuscripts have been used throughout church history around the world, it's like, man, like, we've got to have some proof of this. Like, where do we go to actually identify, like, this really did happen? Especially when it comes to the idea that there were Latin manuscripts or Latin passages that were never in the original Greek that made their way into the Greek to give us what we have today to make it spurious. So I don't know what your take would be on that, Jonathan, but let's see where you would go with that.
Well, let me bring up a couple of things, because, I wanted to understand their logic on how this can be physically possible. Because if we're talking about adding a passage to Scripture, we're not talking about something magical like hocus pocus. We're talking about a physical transcription into a text. And because we don't just have one text, but we have thousands of churches all over the Roman Empire, you got to sort of get them into all the texts. Now, I asked Dr. Elijah Hickson to really explain this theory a little more on this question. Now, he stated, now, this happened over the course of several centuries, bit by bit. Now, more popular readings gain traction, and less popular readings stop being copied. And this can happen through the correction process, by which manuscripts are corrected in the direction of the Byzantium text, of which we know numerous examples, or through the initial copying process. Now, this term is floated out a lot. James White uses it, that the scribes had this tendency to correct in the direction of the Byzantium text. But remember, their conclusion is that the text, the ecclesiastical text, the Byzantium, the Vulgate, and the Peshitta, they're secondary in origin. So what that means is at one point in history, these texts did not exist. They did not physically exist, which means they had to be created and come into being. So according to all these scholars' hypothesis, the Syrian-Byzantium text form did not originally exist. Then different scribes, that we don't know who these guys were, but scribes in general, all over the Greek Orthodox world, were correcting texts in the direction of a text type that did not exist. And without any modern means of communication, they were basically coming up with the same readings in the direction of a text that did not originally exist. So I'm not sure if these scribes had telepathy, and they were able to project their mind into the future to see what these readings that they were correcting in the direction of the Byzantium text would be. But they have a text that didn't exist that they're trying to bring the text into. And that's why when I look at this, we need to evaluate the historical accurateness of what they're saying.
Yeah.
Remember, Uthman was able to conduct a revision of the Quran and distribute it all over the major provinces. The Vulgates. We understand a lot of the history that went into the Vulgate, the history of it, Jerome's process. They had all this discussion. Now, nowhere in history, and when I talk about history, by the available documents, do we have where any of this standardization was being done in the Greek Orthodox Church until 1904. There's not one letter by a bishop. There is not one council talking about the process that they're saying that happened. Now, you notice they don't mention what churches this was happening at. Was it Alexandria? Was this Antioch? Was this Ephesus? Was this in Asia Minor? Where were they coming over from the West to illustrate readings that are not in the Greek text? And the Greek church was like, hey, yeah, sure, go ahead, give us that stuff. There is no historical document from the ancient world, from a bishop or a council or a letter that says this was the type of activity that was going on.
So
none whatsoever.
That seems to be a pretty big observation there, that there are examples of the origination of texts that have circulated, but when it comes to the origination of the Byzantine text platform, it seems like there's got to be some sort of collaboration in order for all of this to happen, and there's no evidence that there was any collaboration or conspiracy. It seems like it's more of a conspiracy to say, like, hey, you know what, like, everyone's text is in agreement, but we don't have any source of collaboration to show, like, this is what's happening to support the claim that it was secondary in origin. And you're saying, like, hey, like, if we're going to take that position, we've got to have some actual evidence that this is what happened. And it seems like this is a claim that of what would have happened to give a secondary origination position that would discredit the Byzantine platform. but it doesn't seem like that exists. So am I kind of understanding your position there on that?
You are, and let me just be the first to say that this isn't my position. Now, those at the top of the field that are advocating this position are saying the same thing. I mean, Kurt and Barbara Allen, who, we're talking about the Nestle Allen Tech, they too say that there's no adequate history that has yet to be written of the Byzantium text, but this is a task that will lead to a future generation. Birdsall, after conducting analysis to test these premises to see if they were true, says the same thing when he refers to the work of Lake, Lagrange, Cowell, and Streeter, that it's evident all our presuppositions concerning the Byzantium text or texts must be doubted, and we need to begin a new investigation because all our premises are falsified. And I think this is important to note because where in science, if they're talking about their approach is scientific and we're trying to give a historical process, where in science, where all your premises have been falsified, do you still maintain your conclusion?
So, okay, now this is something that I think that somebody like Elijah Hickson would ask you the same question as far as support for the falsifiability of their position. You're saying that their position has been falsified, and maybe this is something that we'll get to as we go through the conversation today. But is that something that we can touch on now to kind of identify where it has been falsified, or are we going to get there and just to slow down on my end?
Yeah, no. Let's talk about that. So remember, the initial position by Hort was that Lucan of Antioch created a text at Antioch that was then pushed upon the Church of Antioch. And then that text was so popular by the preaching of Chrysostom that the rest of the Greek Orthodox churches followed that mainstream text. And so they were bringing it in line. It became so popular, and this became the standard text. So Hort had originally that this was done. Now, there's evidence that Lucan of Antioch obviously did an edition of the Septuagint, but even Kenyon pointed out there's no history to support that Lucan actually did an edition of the New Testament. There's no historical document that says he did, so there's no support for that. Now, Birdsall, later on, he's saying, okay, well, the text was uniform from the time of Chrysostom, and it was eventually standardized by the 9th century. So Birdsall is actually doing a study on the text of Fotis of Constantinople to see if he can see this standardized text. So when he did that study, he also found that there was no standardized text, even in the 9th century by the Patriarch of Constantinople when he was looking at the text of Fotis. So that's why he makes the statement that all our presuppositions concerning the Byzantium text as secondary in origin have been falsified. That's a huge statement coming from one of their top scientists. And even Kurt and Barbara Allen has said that there's no adequate history. So there's no viable history for what they were saying. And I think, where Gurry and Dr. Wasserman come in is they were able to further falsify their theory when it came to the text types. Because remember, Lucan was taking, the Western text and the neutral text, and he was putting these all together for his conflation. And then Gurry and Wasserman come out to say the whole notion of the text types to help explain the origin and history of the text has no historical reliability, because once we try to put it on the computers, that requires actual criterion, it couldn't be done. So in the sense of building any type of textual decisions off the premise of text types is invalid because they do not exist. There's no historical reliability to this term.
Okay. Okay, so let's take a second. I want to pause right here and just give a brief kind of mention of the conversation that we've been having on Twitter. When I put this original post out that you and I were going to be talking, we had a lot of conversation that came up along this side of the conversation in particular, where we're talking about the ecclesiastical text, but more in particular, one of the things that I'd put on there was that we're really having a tough time finding anybody who's willing to debate you. And we've talked to Peter Gurry, we've talked to Elijah Hickson, we've talked to, or at least reached out to Daniel Wallace and James White, and a few other people, and we did. There was one guy who said that he would debate you, and that's James Snap. And obviously that's something that we may or may be able to work out as we go along, and I want to get your take on that. But he says this. He says, I would be happy to debate Jonathan Sheffield about 1 John 5:7 anytime. I'd be quite happy to debate Jonathan Sheffield about text-critical methodologies, particularly the way he falls back on the quote-unquote, but the text of the Apostolic Churches says approach at any time. And if his position is that the textus receptus equals the original text in all points, I would be quite happy to debate him about that too. And then obviously he talks about having space in his calendar because, I mean, pretty much everybody's on lockdown with the coronavirus. So anyways, so Jonathan, it seems like the main points that you're hitting on, that there would have to be some Lucan recension adhered to by a critical text advocate in order to discredit the credibility of the Byzantium text platform, or the TR text platform in general. But where would you kind of like to lead in that discussion, or why do you think that we're having such a tough time finding these text scholars to debate you on any particular aspect of this conversation? And then I'll give you my take on it.
Well, when we talk about scholars like Dr. Peter Gurry, Dr. Wasserman, James White, Daniel Wallace, me and Elijah are really good friends. We've had a really great discussion publicly and privately on this issue. So I think there's a lot of genuineness, at least with Elijah. Hey, we're really good friends. Same thing with, so does Stephen. We're really good friends. We don't want to go into a discussion where things maybe get said or things get a little elevated. So I totally think those are totally genuine and correct, because I would perceive it from the same point as well. When we look at scholars like Dr. Peter Gurry, Dr. Wasserman, James White, and even Wallace, they understand the predicament that of what's being said here. They know this is the problem. They understand they don't have any historical basis for what they're saying. Even when it comes to questions that I have asked Dr. Wasserman in the past, they understand that this is the predicament, or this is their major problem. They can't show anything that they're arguing in their premises actually happened historically. And the problem goes back to, if all my premises have been falsified, why aren't I reconsidering the status of the ecclesiastical text?
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem, is they understand what my argument is. They understand this is their problem, and they really have no fallback position except to control the narrative, or their postmodern narrative, in hoping people don't understand really what they're saying, that there's no historical basis for what they're saying.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, and hopefully we'll be able to get that worked out in the future, that maybe we can get a debate set up. But dude, I totally understand it. And you and I were talking with Stephen Boyce earlier, And it's like, you guys are really good friends. Elijah and you are really good friends. And maybe that's one of those deals where it's like, well, we don't want to hurt the friendship on it. And what I'd mentioned to you in private was, it's like, I totally understand that. And at the same time, it's like, gosh, man, there's so many of us sitting back here on the sidelines going, we want to see that conversation. But anyways, let's move on to our next point, where you've got a quote here from Maurice Robinson, where he says, the working presumption of most eclectic scholars, including Ehrman, is that the vast bulk of New Testament manuscripts basically should be excluded as irrelevant for the primary establishment of the text, unquote. Now, can you kind of unpack that particular point there and how that relates to everything that you've said leading up to this so far?
Okay, so since their conclusion is these texts are not viable or are not the best witnesses, we need to focus on the best witnesses that can give us actual account of what happened. I think to give a better example of what this means, suppose a crime was committed in Times Square. Now, the people that you would want to give testimony on that are the people that were in Times Square at that time, or the people closest rated to the event. Now, if years later all this hearsay is going around and there's people say, no, here's what really happened, you really want to focus your interview or your examination to those that are closer representatives to what happened in Times Square at that particular time. So this is essentially what text critics like Dr. Gurry, Dr. Wasserman, White, Wallace are saying, and even Ehrman, is that we have these texts like Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, P66, P75. There's really just a handful of these documents that they say are closer representatives to the type of text used by the Greek Orthodox Church. And because the Byzantium, the Vulgate, the Peshitta, it's a bunch of hearsay that you're getting. So you're not going to be able to resolve anything by going to hearsay. You want to go to the closer representatives. So we're going to stick with these basic texts and basically ignore everything else. So these are the witnesses we are going to concentrate on, since there's no viable testimony to be given by the later manuscripts. So that's what they're saying. I'm going to focus on these witnesses, since I believe they were on scene and they could give us better testimony than all the hearsay that happened afterwards. Does that make sense?
It does. So, and we've got one last point here on whether or not the ecclesiastical texts are secondary in origin. But before we move into the question of what would actually give them the idea that they are secondary in origin, but you've got a quote there from, or not a quote. You've got a comment here about Dr. Gurry chiding Wallace and White. In regard to appealing to the vast majority of New Testament manuscripts for recovering the text of the New Testament when they don't actually use them. And I think that's a huge point to unpack there. So if you could, please just take a second and do that for us.
Sure. Now, first, this was an article that appeared on Evangelical Textual Criticism. I could definitely send you the link later, where in debates that Daniel Wallace and James White have had with Dr. Ehrman, they appeal to what they refer to as the embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, you're right.
So we're talking about 5,600 Greek manuscripts. We're talking about 10,000 manuscripts in Latin. We're talking about 1,000 in Aramaic. But Ehrman's quick to report, well, you just said most of those manuscripts are garbage. They can't be trusted. They're not reliable witnesses. Your embarrassment of riches are really about a handful of manuscripts, let's say 45. So you can't appeal to all this evidence that you don't even say is viable, that you would never bring into any court of law. So he sort of chides them to say, don't appeal to something that you don't even use, because we don't even value the witness testimony contained in those. So we're only looking at these witnesses. Don't say we have all these witnesses when we really don't. We really have this.
Yeah.
So it shows that the critical text position is basing their edition on a very small representative of manuscripts, not what they try to throw out there to the people. Because what they're basically saying is, we're throwing out all this evidence except for a handful of documents. So we don't really have that much that we're basing our textual decisions off of.
No, and that's a good point. And this is something that I bring up all the time. I'm like, gosh, you're saying that you've got 5,800 manuscripts to support your position, but in reality, the critical text is built on about 94% of these 45 manuscripts that support the Alexandrian stream, and then the remaining 5 or 6% is kind of the eclectic side of it. Like, well, we've got to use some of these 5,800 manuscripts to support our statement that we have this many. So it's like, man, you really do have foundational differences between these different text platforms, and it seems to me a little dishonest to make the claim like, listen, we've got this vast number of manuscripts that support our position, when in reality you only use about 45 of those 5,800 manuscripts, and yet you want to make the claim that you've got that many that are in support, when in reality it's kind of the reverse side. Listen, the TR position is the one that actually genuinely has the 5,700 plus manuscript support for this text platform, and it just seems a little more genuine to make that position from a TR side. But you look like you want to say something, so I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, no, you keep going. I'm just agreeing with what you're saying, and I think there's another caveat to that statement, and it goes down to provenance, because I think it would be more honest to say that we have all these manuscripts. We know the history and the provenance and the origins of the Vulgate. We know the Assyrian churches or the Aramaic churches that used the Peshitta. We know the text that is represented that came down through the Greek Orthodox churches. But we're going to throw all that away for these texts that we don't know where they come from at all.
Yeah.
And those are going to be the basis for our documents.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads into the next point on what's the benefit of provenance. I don't know if you had anything to add. I just wanted
No. That's a good transition. I was wanting to transition from there as well. So, do you want to pick up on the point of provenance, or do you want to talk about the reason why they think that the ecclesiastical text would be secondary in origin?
Yeah, so let's go into provenance, because it kind of ties in with everything that we're sort of saying up to this point. Perfect. So let's talk about provenance. So provenance is the origin and history of any artifact. In archaeology, provenance is a sort of unit of measure to evaluate the value of a particular artifact. So whether it's a painting, it's a column, provenance tells us the history and origin, where did it come from, and everything else. Now, one of the problems that the text critics have when they say they're being so historical is the issue of provenance. Now, Dr. Wasserman brings it up in his book, To Cast the First Stone, on page 186, in that the origins of both Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are some of their prime manuscripts that they're using for the basis of their textual editions, actually remain frustratingly elusive, despite generations of scholarly debate seeking to clarify and resolve the problem. So the thing about provenance is where they come from. So if you think about a witness walking into court trying to give testimony, we're essentially asking that witness, well, were you at the scene of the crime? And he's basically coming back and telling you, well, I don't know. So what information do you have available for us? I don't know. So if their premise are these texts like Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, P75, P66 are closer representatives, well, they need to establish the provenance that those are indeed the texts that were used by the official Greek Orthodox churches. And the thing is, we can test that very easily because we have 2 4th century documents that said are closer representatives to the text used by the Greek Orthodox Church. We can test that by an actual Greek Orthodox Church that can trace back to the apostles. And when that text, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are compared to the type of text that was preached on at Antioch by John Chrysostom, it doesn't look like that text. And over in the western part of the churches, we have Rome, which also does trace back. And Jerome says he used early Greek manuscripts, so his Vulgate is a witness to the Greek text 4th century or earlier. So Jerome's Greek text may even be earlier than Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. They represent a different type of text. So the question is, where do these texts come from? Whether I'm evaluating if these texts are good or bad or indifferent, I cannot tell because I don't know who these texts belong to. I don't know who the author was. What was the methodology that went into the creation of that text? So they are throwing away the texts that were publicly preached on from the ecclesiastical text for a handful of texts we don't know where they come from.
Okay, so I have people all the time that bring this up to me, like, Josh, why do you even have these conversations? Like, what is the benefit of having conversations like this? It seems like it's so far above the normal average Christian's head that it's like, what's the point? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And I always point out, like, listen, we're talking about the credibility of the Word of God. If we can't trust what is written in the Word of God, and there is some form or some element of doubt that this should or shouldn't be in the Bible, then what's to say that we can't trust anything that's written in the Bible? And ultimately, that's what it comes back to for me personally. Like, the value of these conversations are invaluable to me. One guy said, like, man, why are you going to talk about 1 John 5:7 again? Like, we beat a dead horse. Let's stop talking about it. Why do we even have to have these conversations? Like, it just seems like it has no benefit. But for you, it seems like you've kind of got the same perspective here. Like, it really does matter. So many guys like Nick Sayers, it really does matter. Like, why would we compromise on what is and what isn't the Word of God? And I'm not saying that guys like Elijah Hickson or Peter Gurry would say that they are compromising on what is and isn't in the Bible, because they would believe, like, obviously we've made additions. We're accepting a text that has made additions to the Bible, and we're saying, like, let's have a pedigree for supporting that statement. Like, let's see the evidence, the empirical scientific evidence to go back and look at and say this was added at some point in history. And it seems like you are looking at it from that angle. You're looking at it from that angle, going, we know multiple times throughout church history that heretics have tried to bring in different aspects or different passages, different readings, different gospels into what we would call Scripture, and it was rejected. It was called out. They were called out, and so on. But in this particular side of the conversation, you are using a word that I've never heard of before, and it seems like somebody else heard it as well. And I said providence, you've said provenance. So if you could just, I know that you gave a definition for it, but if you could clarify for us what it is and how it's related to this conversation. I know you spent a lot of time explaining it, but just touch on that for a minute. Why is this conversation important, and how does it relate to provenance?
Well, so think about it. We're dealing with biblical manuscripts. Okay, so they are, ancient artifacts or Christian artifacts. So the text is tangible. And we're having a historical discussion on the text of the New Testament. I mean, the apostles handed them down to the churches. They came in possession of physical people. And we're trying to evaluate that we found these texts that don't look like the texts that have been transmitted by the physical churches, and they're different. So now we're trying to evaluate the credibility of those documents, just like we would do with any witness coming into any normal court of law. So tell me, where do you come from, and what are your origins in history? For example, the Vulgate. We know who the editor of the Vulgate was. It was Jerome. Where did he do that? In Bethlehem. He had a team of individuals with him. We have conversations describing his methodology, that he was going to the original Greek as the basis, and he would only use Latin readings if they had Greek support. We have Augustine, who was able to vet Jerome's Gospels against Greek manuscripts. So when we talk about origins and history of the Vulgate, we have all those pieces of information to tell us, where did the Vulgate come from? Now, if we want to understand the provenance of Antioch, we could just go to our Bibles and see this is where the disciples were first called Christians. We know Paul had went there. This was one of the earliest surviving Greek churches. You have Jerusalem, and then you have Antioch, that were set up and organized by the apostles. And that church received the official documents. And so when we look 400 or 300 years later, we see a text that is being publicly preached on by John Chrysostom, who's overseeing this church. So we know the provenance of where that text comes from because we know where Antioch comes from. We know that church. So provenance in archaeology and history is determining the origins in history to evaluate any artifact. And the fact that some of these scholars feel like provenance is not an issue, it is not important, is not being historical or scientific. It's a unit of measurement of history to evaluate any artifact. And so when it's saying, well, provenance doesn't matter, it just shows how unscientific and unhistorical they're being about their process. Because a historian wouldn't say that. When I asked that question to Dr. Wasserman, he would not substantiate the fact that provenance isn't important. But in the case of the biblical manuscripts, that we're making such altering changes to the text of Scripture, they're throwing away this very important piece of measurement.
No, that's good. And for those of you who are writing in right now and in the chat, yeah, we're going to have time for questions at the end. And the number for that is 816-866-0025. I'll put it up on the screen as well. But we'll have time for you to call in and ask Jonathan your questions, or to challenge him on a point that he made that you think may or may not be incorrect or needs some more clarification. So we'll get to that as well. Let's okay. There's so much to this conversation that we can have, and it's needed. But let's get to our next point, where we're talking about the idea that the ecclesiastical texts are secondary in origin. What would give some of these guys who take that position a reason to support that?
Well, if you think about it, there's all their premises to support it, whether it was the Lucian recession, whether it was the Rebullion recession, whether it was a standardization process where it's all these imaginary scribes changing everything and coming up with the same text. There really is no basis. The problem is there's a huge industry out there that has been created since the evolution of this theory that is supporting two major Bible publishing industries. So you have the Nestle Allen and the UBS. So if for some reason these texts if they went back and said, well, we're going to go back and re-examine our position, this would be the end of an industry. Because if your basis is the ecclesiastical text, every time they dig up some document in a hole in Egypt, you can't create new evidence to create a new edition of the Nestle-Aland or the UBS. So if you think about it, to maintain your copyright, you need X amount of changes to happen, or changes in the document to maintain that. And what we've had in this industry, when we look at the Nestle-Aland, which really first becomes with Hort's text, and then we have 28 editions that happen afterwards, where the text is constantly in flux. It's a never-ending cycle of passages being removed and changed and updated with every new piece of evidence or document they find in the garbage heap that's going to change our Bible. Now, God's not the author of confusion. And we have a process where every year or so we'll come up with a new edition that's flooding the market with all these different editions.
Okay, so when we did our roundtable discussion with Peter Gurry, Jeff Riddle, and James Snap Jr., Peter Gurry asked Jeff Riddle, like, hey, so what's the point of me having a job doing text criticism? Do you think there's any, should I be doing this? Is there any purpose to it? And Jeff Riddle's response was, no, there's no purpose to it. You really shouldn't. I mean, there's nothing that you're going to do to affect the text that God hasn't already preserved. And obviously, he takes a position, a TR position from a confessional perspective, and I'm not a Reformed Calvinist who takes a confessional perspective on the text or the TR, but I do believe the TR is what God has providentially preserved from an eclectic point of view. And I don't think there's a lot of nuances to that point there. But how would you respond to Peter Gurry, who, if he were sitting here, would ask you the same question? Like, is there any point of me having a job? Should I have this job in text criticism? What am I doing? Am I wasting my time?
Well, I think it's important to note that in the history of this argument, there's never been where we are against textual criticism. I mean, we support the biblical scholarship of Jerome. We support the biblical scholarship of the magisterial reformers. So, you know, what they're trying to do, Cardinal Jimenez, Erasmus, the AV committee, is they noticed that there were differences in the ecclesiastical text, and they're trying to resolve those differences. So there wasn't, even though there were issues and there were fights, we've always supported that type of biblical scholarship. Now, what I would commend or point out to Dr. Gurry is what we are not for, because if you think about it, Bergen and Scrivener was part of the RV committee. They had no problem with polishing up, looking at the evidence to make adjustments. Bergen felt like the authorized version would always be there for the people, that they would have an editor's edition to look for the scholars. But what they are against is throwing away all the church texts for these texts of unknown provenance. So that's really what we're against, and I think this is what's happening. We're seeing scriptures being taken out, and what I would tell Dr. Gurry is this is what we're against, because you're throwing away the ecclesiastical text for texts of unknown provenance, and your additions are being based on these texts that were not received by the official Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches. So you're basing your editions that you're publishing to the people, texts that aren't the official documents that were received by the official churches. That's what we're against.
Okay, so here's a question to point out here. Why do you think that it's important to consider or place such a high value on what the official Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches did and did not receive?
Well, So if you think about the basis is, well, because then that opens up a whole different conversation. Remember, we have 4 Gospels, but there was over 50 different Gospel publications that were published in the ancient world. So the question is, if our investigation is to determine what came from the apostles, then we should naturally go back to the scene of the crime and see what was given to the churches of the apostles. Yeah. Irenaeus makes this point in the 2nd century when he's dealing with the textual claims of the Gnostics, in that, the text of the apostles can be seen in every church for those who want to see the truth. Now, that's an objective framework for us to go to the churches, because the question is, what are the original writings of the apostles? And to determine that, I need to know who are the closest representatives to the apostles, and that is the churches. And the apostles handed on those texts physically to those churches. So the closest representative I have is through those means. Yeah. And it ties back into the argument of provenance, that God used physical means in preserving his text. And if we're talking about what is the text that were handed on to the apostles, to their church, well, the churches were the witnesses and guardians. So if I'm trying to understand their text, do I not go to the witnesses and guardians of those texts? Yeah. Or do I go to who weren't the witnesses and guardians?
No, that's a good point. So, okay, for those of you who are listening in and viewing live right now, I want to let you know that in about 15 or 20 minutes, I want to open it up to questions. And if we don't, in between questions, if we have a point that we want to continue and hit on until another one comes in, I think we can do it that way. We're at about an hour and 10 minutes right now, and that'll give us about an hour and a half or so of the stream before we can open it up to you. That should give you enough material to listen to and then come up with some questions or some challenging points to what Jonathan has already made. And that number is 816-866-0025. But let's get back to our point, the next point in our conversation here, where you say that Dr. Ehrman informs us that the earliest surviving manuscripts have a text different from the ecclesiastical text, and asks, why does the different text show up early and consistently early rather than consistently later? If they're earlier, aren't they more likely the original?
Yeah, so I think that's really what we're talking about, because Dr. Ehrman realizes that there is a difference between these texts. We're not talking about small changes. We're talking about some major differences, and even Ehrman points out that there's a number of doctrinal differences between these texts that really come into the conversation. So the question is earlier better? Well, that depends. I mean, we have a number of early texts would we consider as earlier. That goes to the point, is everything earlier always better? Remember, the earliest person at the scene of the crime is the murderer. So obviously, sometimes you're not going to get your best testimony out of these documents. So the question is earlier better? Well, Marcion's text was pretty earlier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think it's important that a number of the documents that we have out there, the Nag Hammadi, all those texts, those are earlier documents. Would we, are all those, they are earlier, so does it make it better? This is why the question of evaluating the evidence is not always on a point in time, but it really comes down to the true point. What is truly earlier? And the point I want to make on this is that Tertullian, who actually writes 4 or 5 against Marcion, is dealing with the same issue that we're dealing with now, because Marcion, in the 2nd century, specifically stated that the text of the churches had been interpolated by the defenders of Judaism for doctrinal purposes. So they were trying to create their form of Christ to support their theological views. So Marcion made that objection very early on, and it's really what James White and others are making a reference, that those texts are secondary in origin. Now, Marcion made that claim. The interesting, when we talk about earlier, Marcion, brings up that point that, my gospel is the true one. Marcion says that his gospel is the true one. And what is it going to settle the point for us except to be the principle of time, which rules the authority, that which is found to be more ancient and assumes as an elementary truth the corruption of doctrine belongs. So, and it's interesting because we have an actual model of an actual debate dealing with the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul that Marcion said were the original writings, which were shorter, not better, and he said were the originals. And it's interesting that Tertullian lays out an objective framework for us on how to evaluate this and how to show that Marcions aren't the original. And so what he says is that if it is evidently more true which is earlier, if that which is earlier is from the beginning, and if that which is from the beginning, which has the apostles for its author, then it would be certainly be quite as evident that that which comes down from the apostles, which has been kept as a sacred deposit in the churches of the apostles. So he sets up the investigation is if we're trying to understand the original writings of the apostles and we want to understand what they handed down, the earliest publications of those documents would have been to the churches that the apostles set up and organized for them to hand down.
Yeah.
And that's why we see him referring to the church of the Corinthians, the church of the Galatians, the Philippians, the Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Rome, to show that the text that Marcion was witnessing with shorter readings do not look like the text that can trace back to the apostles. So he's giving us an objective framework to compare with. And we're using the same model historically to compare their texts against when we compare them to Rome and Antioch and the rest of the Greek.
Okay, so those are all good points. One thing that I remember Peter Gurry bringing up in the conversation that we had in our roundtable was that regarding the methodology differences, really not a methodological difference, but the tendency of a scribe, not an original scribe, but a scribe that would be responsible for making a copy, would be a tendency to keep a longer ending as opposed to getting rid of a longer ending and going with a shorter ending. So kind of Occam's razor for the methodology for the critical text position. They would say typically the shorter ending is what should be kept and retained in the text, when it seems like even in that same critical text advocacy, you've got differing scholars who would say, listen, like Gurry saying no, they would stick with the longer ending just to make sure that if it's authentic, they're not getting rid of something that is authentic and going with a shorter ending. And then, guys like Wallace would say, hey, listen, no, we go with the shorter ending because that's more likely to be what the scribe would have recorded originally. So anyways, you've touched on that a little bit, but it seems like kind of a summary for what you're describing here, and I want to make sure I'm understanding it right. This is what you put in the notes. It says, if the ecclesiastical texts are secondary in origin, that means at one time in history they didn't exist, they had to be created. So naturally it would beg the question, how was it created? And you're saying this process cannot be magical. And guys like Ehrman understand that the scholarship of this sort has to be historical. So you say, remember, history is measured based on the available documents left behind. And it seems like obviously you're taking the position that the critical text advocate who holds to the critical text methodology does not have the pedigree or the provenance to support the text that came that they're using in in their text when they don't have the provenance to know where those texts even came from when we do for the TR. So let's move on to kind of explaining the creation of the ecclesiastical text, and review the premise used to explain the creation of the ecclesiastical text, and see where you want to start with that.
Yeah, so you go over some good points, and once again, their initial problem is if the Byzantine text form was created, someone had to do it. You need an editor, let's say someone like a Jerome, or as Hort and Burkitt pointed out, they actually referred to historical figures because they understood you needed an actual mechanism. It can't be make-believe. The text can't just show up out of thin air and into all these churches, and scribes can't just magically just come up with readings and start adding it to the churches. So it has to be created. I mean, we're talking about physical passages. So if you think about the last 12 verses of Mark, the woman in adultery, 1 John 5:7, without cause, we're talking about hundreds of scriptures. And what they're saying is all these hundreds of scriptures were added throughout thousands of churches, independent churches, part of the Greek Orthodox churches, and the Aramaic churches out in the West, and they all magically come up with basically the same type of text, but there are differences in there, which shows that they were independent. So it doesn't show like anything was actually standardized because those variances are different. Yeah. So when we talk about created, we're talking about physically, and there's no historical documentation that ever any such standardized happened. I mean, when we talk about available documents, we're talking about letters from bishops. We're talking about the Church of the Seven Ecumenical Councils, all these discussions, and not one where they were all coming together to talk about all these differences. They discussed variances, but they didn't talk where all these scribes had a free hand to go do whatever they want, and they all magically came up with the same reasons. And when they talk about this idea of a standard that the shorter is better, based on their black swan is Marcion, because in Marcion's case, shorter is not better. So that's the black swan of their principle, because in the 2nd century we had a shorter text that was not better. So the whole principle that shorter is better, do we hear Jerome, who was one of the greatest textual critics of the 4th century, use that principle? When Tertullian was debating Marcion on which text of Luke best represented the text of the apostles, did he immediately concede to the point that whatever is shorter is most likely original? So Marcion, you win this debate. Where does such an idea, and where it comes out of, is an evolutionary framework that only starts to rear its ugly head at the end of the 17th century out of the German schools. It's shorter because it's earlier. So they're trying to prove an evolutionary point. It's like what they do with Mark. Even though there's no empirical statement from the ancient world in any document from any father that said Mark is first, they still hold to a view that, well, Mark must be first because it's shorter. The same principle is being applied in these readings. The shorter must be original because they're trying to establish an evolutionary view for the creation of the ecclesiastical text, making it secondary in origin.
Okay, so let's, I want to open it up to questions in just a minute, guys. Sure. But one thing that you had mentioned before we get into kind of where Hort and Burkitt, where that plays, where their theory plays a role on the recension of Lucan, and then Rubella of Edessa and the Peshitta, what was I going to say? Oh, one thing that you had just brought up was kind of the falsehood, or I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, for German rationalism. How do you think it led up to German rationalism? What do you think what influence that played into the critical text, and how is that tied into kind of what we've already talked about leading up from the foundation that we've laid so far?
Well, remember, we're talking about the post-Enlightenment period, the age of reason. We're much smarter than they were back then. So they start bringing in what we start seeing that happens in the German schools is these theories that really start to question everything. The idea that Jesus was not a historical figure really comes out of that. The view that Marcion's text was the original corpus of the Gospels start to come out of the Tübingen school. You have a goblet store that out of the German schools that says, well, Mark is first, and then you have Greisbach and these people that really start to question the last 12 verses of Mark. So what you start putting together is, okay, Mark was first. It didn't have the last 12 verses of Mark, which means there was really no, wasn't no eyewitness resurrection account, and it goes into the Tübingen school in Germany, where Marcion's text was really original, which basically creates this view that Jesus wasn't really historical, and then you have these scholars starting to promote that Jesus was really a myth and nothing is really historical coming out of the Gospels, and that by Fraser, all of a sudden everything that the Christian story, even though it's true, it's really based on a lot of these pagan ideas and that came out of mythology. So this is what's happening that's coming out of the German schools that Hort eventually brought into the church and into text criticism. And this is where the breaking point was, because there was always text criticism before this. The issue becomes now is they brought in the German rationalism of the late 17th, 18th century into the physical church, into the Church of England, which has now spawned this new industry.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. You've talked about the Lucan recension, and you've talked a little bit about Hort. You haven't talked too much about Burkitt yet, but I do want to understand, you make this point here that they are setting up a theoretical mechanism to support their conclusion. And typically what we would say is you want to draw your conclusions from the mechanisms that you're studying. So, and if you were looking in the medical field, typically you want to have a conclusion that's drawn from the evidence that you're looking at, rather than bringing a conclusion to what you are studying in order to support your conclusion. So it's a little bit backwards, but let's talk about that for a second. What do you think the role that Hort and Burkitt had as it is related to the conclusions that you're saying they had prior to those theoretical mechanisms to support that conclusion itself?
Well, remember, if the ecclesiastical text, the Vulgate, the Assyrian Byzantine text form, and the Peshitta are secondary in origin, then you need some sort of physical interruption in the church to transition to these new type of texts. So think about it from this standpoint. Their conclusions or their secondary. You need an actual historical mechanism to make your conclusion a reality. So there needed to be, just like Uthman. Uthman did a revision of the Quran and sent it out to all those provinces. He was the top caliph. He had the power to do so. He had the team of scholars to do it, and he had power to force it upon churches. So that's an actual historical documentation that we have of that.
Now, let me stop you right there just for a second. I don't want you to lose your thought, but you seem like you have a little sharper memory than I do. So while I've got this thought in my head, James White would say that a TR advocate is in the same boat as any Muslim who would take the position that they've got their text now. This is it. It's settled because of the work that Uthman did in controlling the text. So he would say, well, the TR advocate has the same dilemma because now we've got our text. It was given to us in the Reformation period, and it's settled. We don't need to do any adjustment to it, blah, blah, blah. So what would you say on that and kind of piggybacking where you were going with the conversation before?
So it's a little different because, once again, the Church of England wasn't against any type of text critical revisions or updates. I mean, Scrivener was on the revision committee. He knew all the issues. Bergen had examples where he thought improvements on the TR could be made. But what James White, Dr. Gurry, what Wallace are saying is totally different. They're saying you need to abandon all the ecclesiastical texts because all these, this big interruption in the church happened that created these texts, and we have to go back to the originals, those are closer to do that. So they're speaking about two different things there. We're not talking about, we're talking about small little updates or revisions for the language. We're not talking about creating a new text, and that's what's happening here. What James White, Dr. Gurry, what they're talking about is creating a brand new text. Yeah. And that's why there was such concern in 1881 when the RV came out, because they created a brand new text that was never the scope for the revision project at all. They came in and they brought in documents that can't be shown to ever been used by any Greek Apostolic Church before 1881, and introduced a new text. So they're the ones that are changing things, not us. The reformers were actually dealing with the differences between the ecclesiastical texts to resolve the differences in the Vulgate, the Peshitta, and the text of the Greek Orthodox churches. That's what they're trying to do. They weren't creating a new. They're not throwing away all those documents. They were trying to resolve differences. What these guys are doing is trying to create a brand new text by throwing away what the churches have received.
Okay, so that's good. It seems like what you're saying is a critical text advocates, that process started with Hort under German rationalism that led to bringing in a conclusion that they had already drawn, that there was issues with the text. Now I wanted to open it up to our audience. We've got the number up on the line. If you want to call in, you can. We've got our first call coming in now, so we'll turn that over to Jonathan for our first caller. Let me see who we've got on the line here.
To accept, press 1. To send a voicemail, press 2.
This is Josh, and we've got you on the line now. Who is it that we're speaking with? This is the first time that I've actually done the call-ins like this, so this is kind of cool to do it. But anyways, who do we got on? Stephen Boyce. All right. So, yes, this is Jonathan's buddy. So, all right. How's the sound for you guys who are listening live right now? Can you type in a message and let me know how it sounds when Stephen starts to talk? And then, Stephen, I'll turn it over to you and let you ask your question.
Sure. Yeah. Just let me know when you want me to ask.
Yeah, whenever you're ready, man. Yep, you got it.
Can Jonathan hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Stephen.
Can Jonathan hear me?
Yep, he can hear you. And I've got his sound coming in on my headphones. So, yeah, you'll have to hear his response on your computer.
This is something that Jonathan and I have talked about extensively for hours and hours and hours. And I want him to clarify this for everybody. He brought up the comparison of older by using Marcion's text and corruption of specifically Luke, and then also the Gnostic texts that are earlier that were found in Nag Hammadi. But you'd have to clarify, Jonathan, that even a person who is utilizing what would be considered more of a, if you want to use the term Alexandrian or a similar text that would come from that, whatever you want to call providence or whatever, could easily have detected Marcion's heresy with a critical edition and the Gnostic edition by saying, hey, this is not the original text, this is something that's deviated, this is heretical, there's cuts. Somebody could do that with a critical text edition, could they not?
Yeah, well, I think what it's important to do is when we're...
I can hear Jonathan. I don't know if you can hear me.
Here, let me... can you hear his response on your computer? If not, I can...
I can switch over. I can switch over to my computer. I'm on my phone. Let me see here.
Okay. If not, I can unplug the headphones on mine and put the sound...
The computer's a little bit behind, but I can probably try to keep up if I have to.
Here, let me do it this way. I'll just unplug... Jonathan, did you get everything that Stephen asked you?
Yeah, no, I got everything.
Okay.
And so when we're dealing with manuscripts or Christian artifacts, biblical texts from the ancient world, it's important to understand in that historical context that there were other groups, good, bad, or indifference, that there was other texts out there where they were adding things, that they were taking away, and we have to be aware that we are given statements of history by Tertullian, by Irenaeus, that there were other texts out there that were being produced that weren't a part of the official stream of churches. So there was people adding things, there were people taking away, and so we have to be mindful that we're finding documents from the ancient world and we have to evaluate them. And so when we look at what are the historical mechanisms for evaluating documents, provenance is a very important tool of measurement, because not anyone can just go into, no one can just go into a museum and say, hey, I have a painting, from Egypt or wherever it may be, from 2nd century BC or 3rd century or for the Roman archives, and say, I want my $10 million. So provenance is very important in establishing the authenticity of the documents. And if our question is, what are the closest representatives or best witnesses of the texts that were used by the Greek Orthodox churches or any of the churches of the apostles, then the question is, are those texts witnesses to the texts of the official Greek churches? So
yeah, but my question, Jonathan, goes back to the fact of, could somebody holding when P66, P75 were completed manuscripts, not the fragments that they are, or an older manuscript that would be considered Alexandrian, if you want to use that terminology, could they have detected Marcion's changes in the Gospel of Luke or Paul's epistles with the manuscripts, like similar to Aleph or B? Could they not have done the same thing and pointed out, hey, this was tampered with beyond measure? We're talking about differences in manuscripts, yeah, but comparing Marcion's manuscripts to the critical text, I think you got to be careful, because somebody's going to listen to this video and think, wow, he's comparing the critical text to Marcion's work. And though the critical text has lesser words, not in every place. There are places where there's longer readings in a critical text than the TR. So it's not like just because it's shorter, automatically that's it. It doesn't always work that way. But could you not admit that comparing Marcion's cutouts is not compatible to what we're talking about in the more of a critical text position view of the text?
Yeah, now I bring up Marcion as a case example that, things were taken out. Now, obviously, that's the extreme case, and that was a very big issue. And the one thing I'm not saying is Vaticanus, P75, P66, they're not Gnostic texts. I wouldn't say that they're Gnostic texts or they're any work of Marcion. The only thing I'm pointing out is things were taken out in the ancient world, things were added in the ancient world. And if we're looking at any text, and when we look at Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and these other texts, not that they're Gnostic in nature, not that they're productions, but the question we have to ask ourselves, how do we authenticate, even though the differences may be small, and to say, well, this is really close because it has readings from all these others. The question is, how do we authenticate it to say, well, this is a good witness to use in our evaluation? You know, I could say that the Vulgate, while there are differences, I would agree. While there's differences, I can say that I know Augustine and the North African bishops vetted Jerome's Gospels translations, and they gave it pretty good marks. I know who.
Would you also admit, Jonathan, that these churches that you're saying are about the Greek Orthodox in North Africa, so forth, their texts did not read identical to each other? You had difference between the Vulgate and, say, the Peshitta. And those read identical to the today's Textus Receptus that Scribner produced. There's readings in the Vulgate that don't align with the TR of today. There's readings in the Peshitta. They didn't even have a complete Bible as far as canon goes in the Peshitta. They had less books. So when we look at the Peshitta, we say, oh, valid. In your position, you say valid. I'm not going to understand your position. Actually, you and I talked extensively how I actually think you have a better view than a lot of modern TR people do today. Yours makes more sense. You actually look at history. You don't just start history from 400 years ago. You do go back in history. But those texts amongst themselves, what Jerome would have been using in the West and Eusebius would have been using in the East, they don't read identical. So how do you make textual decisions amongst valid churches throughout the world that have different readings and different?
Yeah, so it sounds like Stephen is saying, like, listen, you've got differences when you're looking at the perspective of church history, with variants that they had to make textual decisions on what should and shouldn't be in the TR. And he's saying, well, Scribner created the text that the TR that we've got today would have come from, but obviously there's more to be drawn out from that side of the conversation. But anyways, it sounds like Stephen is saying, listen, they're doing the exact same thing that we are doing, and we've just come up with a critical text where you guys have got the Textus Receptus, and there's no difference in what we are doing. It just seems like we're coming to different conclusions.
Well, I would say there's a couple of different differences. And Josh, I want to ask you real quick, because are you in the medical field?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you were in the medical, because I just wanted to bring an analogy. Now, first, he's right. We have to deal with the variants in the ecclesiastical text, because whether you're looking at the Vulgate, you're looking at the Peshitta, or you're looking at the Syrian Byzantium text form, there are differences. So and I know I was talking with Stephen about this reading before, so we look at Jerome's Vulgate and say, well, without cause, he did not use that in the Vulgate. So, obviously Jerome is an authority from the ancient world. Obviously he looked at the evidence, he talks about it, and rendered a different decision than it's found in the TR editions. Now, obviously, when we're holding to a criterion that is the reading apostolic, and does it have independent witness from churches that can also trace back to the apostles, and we see, okay, well, without cause is found, obviously, in the Greek manuscripts. It's found in the Peshitta. We do know that the Donatists did have a conversation with Augustine about this particular passage, which shows that without cause was also in the Old Latin. So, when we're talking about the magisterial reformers having to understand that there are differences like this between the Greek and the Latin, how do we best evaluate that reading? And when we look and see, okay, well, when we look at the witnesses, such as the Aramaic churches, the texts of the Greek Orthodox churches, and even in the Old Latin, we can say that, well, based on the weight of the evidence in this particular instance, we would side with without cause. So the Peshitta goes back through the Aramaic churches. The text of the Greek Orthodox Church has this reading, and the reading's even found in the Old Latin, and they had a discussion on this particular variant between the Donatists and Augustine. And, you know, the Donatists, who were part of North Africa, wouldn't accept bishops that turned over the scriptures. So they had a very strong sense of preserving the scriptures. So that's where, in that particular case, the review of the evidence, we would go with that reading. But remember, the base texts that they're using are the ecclesiastical texts. So my concern is with Gurry's or James White's or Daniel Wallace's view that those manuscripts are the least viable. So if James White, Wallace, and Gurry were saying, well, we're going to base it on this textual foundation, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now.
So, Stephen.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask what your response would be to that, because obviously it sounds like what Jonathan is saying is that, yeah, we are doing the same sort of text critical. We have to make decisions on what is and isn't going to be in the TR, just like you have to make decisions on what's going to or not going to be in a critical text edition. But ultimately what he's saying is there's an eclectic position that has been accepted historically that he would say has been used in the ecclesiastical text, and his definition of that would be what was used in the churches, read in the churches, and supported by the churches in their quotations, and not necessarily simply by the manuscript support that we have extant. But anyway, so I do want to say, whoever just called, please call back, and we'll get you on as soon as we're done with this question. So anyway, Stephen, what would your response be to that?
Yeah, to me, like, the critical text position evaluates the fullness of manuscripts, not one stream. And I think Jonathan knows this, that the critical text people don't have an issue with the Byzantine text. In fact, there's a whole chapter in Myths and Mistakes that Dr. Hickson and Dr. Gurry, who I talk to, mostly Elijah, very often, and there's a whole chapter on how Byzantine isn't secondary text in that book. There are some Byzantine readings that are better than Alexandrian readings. The question that I'm having is not so much, I believe, and most people in the critical text believe, that all manuscripts should be acknowledged and seen and documented, footnoted. The issue that we're having is that even in an ecclesiastical text, if you pull out the Vulgate does not read identical to the text Preceptus of today. There are
Call from.
Sorry, hang on just a second.
Okay, and then if you move south into other places, you go into the Peshitta. People say, well, the Peshitta is a Byzantine. Well, no, it's not, because if you go to the Gospel of Matthew, it has a more Byzantine style in it, but there's places where it actually has Alexandrian in the same Gospel. Same thing with Sinaiticus. The first 8 chapters of John are predominantly Western readings, but people would label the manuscript as a whole Alexandrian. There are places like that where that happened. That's where textual criticism came in. All the TR fathers did it. Erasmus made decisions. Stephanus made decisions. Beza made decisions. My question is, if there's an ecclesiastical text, which I understand what Jonathan means by that, that ecclesiastical text is not identical to the text of Preceptus that people are using today. There are differences. So where do we go for the, if they, I know your position believes like this is the final end-all Word of God, word for word, jot and tittle. We can't go to an ecclesiastical text and say, well, this is it. It's an ecclesiastical text. And then look at the TR and say, well, this is it too, because they're not identical.
Yeah, well, I think it's
not that, Jonathan.
Well, no, I think the point is that decisions were made to resolve differences by the magisterial reformers. And it really comes out of Val's study that there are differences. So they're trying to address those differences, and they're using a certain textual foundation. This scholarship really understood the ancient world, how it was set up, the polity of these churches. They understood how the church operated. And so their scholarship was based on a specific methodology that they were trying to use to resolve those differences. My point of contention is not that we can't discuss these variances, but that which textual witnesses or foundation are we going to base those on? And my problem is, if we start introducing witnesses into the equation that we can't evaluate, it could be similar to a chemist that could be possibly using test tubes that aren't necessarily clean that may fudge his results. So if I'm bringing in documents like Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, while they're interesting to look at, and I'm not saying don't look at them at all, what I'm saying is when we start to get into our textual analysis, we can't weigh them in as a witness because they can't be qualified as such because we don't know where they are. So our base witness text would have to be, and I think it's important to note that the Greek Orthodox text, or the Greek Orthodox churches, when they finally put together their reconstructed text or their standardized text for the Greek Orthodox churches in 1904, they followed this specific methodology. They were going to the ecclesiastical transmitted text, and a lot of their readings do look like a mix between the majority text and TR position.
That's what I'm making is a lot of people, Jonathan, are going to take your position from the TR position and say, well, he's defending a TR. You're contending for something that Scrivener and Burgon were particularly going for in the 19th century, which is not equivalent to the text. Even Scrivener's text, Scrivener did not agree with reading in his own text because he wasn't putting together on his perspective. He was trying to match something with the English translation. Scrivener did not agree with certain readings. Burgon rejected Acts 8:37 because a lot of those ecclesiastical churches did not receive or quote or utilize Acts 8:37. Some did, some did not. So my question is how do you make a textual decision on a text where Burgon looks at Acts 8:37 and says, I don't think it's authentic. I don't think Luke wrote this. I don't think it belongs in the text because of the same methodology you're using. And then there's somebody else on the ecclesiastical side who says, no, this was quoted by, they start listing people that alluded to it. And now you have in the ecclesiastical world two different opinions. Who gets to make the decisive decision to include Acts 8:37 or to remove it? Who gets that decision in your textual view? Because your camp argued over that passage, and Burgon said, I don't think it belongs.
Yeah, once again, from Burgon's point of view, and the same be said for Scrivener and, the Anglican churches, they're trying to look at the available evidence. They were good scholars, but their point of contention as well, both Burgon and Scrivener, is we are not here to create a new text, and that's the fault that they found with Hort, is that a new text was created. The scope of the project wasn't the elimination of the AV, because Burgon felt that the AV would always be there for the people, but that a scholarly edition should exist for the academics to use. So the idea to update, to polish up, that was never against. But the point on introducing a new text or bringing in new evidence that can't be authenticated, this is what set them over the hill. This is what they were actually against, because the reformers, they're trying to work out these differences, and they're using a base text to do so. And the problem comes in is when they're getting off those base texts and saying that we are not to use those as a primarily textual foundation and use something else. And that's really where the fight is, and that's where it really started in 1881.
But didn't Burgon see Acts 8:37 as an addition that made itself in? Even as an ecclesiastical guy like himself and an Anglican, he recognized Acts 8:37 was a later Western tradition that made it into the tradition of manuscript. So he had to make a choice in his scholarship that differed from the Textus Receptus people of today. And they quote him as a champion. But a lot of them would not like Burgon's position. He rejected a lot of readings that are in the modern TR today. He was not a TR. He'd be close to the majority text, I would say. But if you look at Burgon, was he right? Because at the end of the day, that reading is a Western reading in a very minor sense. So who has the right Bible? Do we include it? Do we not include it? Who makes that decision? Burgon says no. Others said yes. Who gets the final decision there?
Yeah, so let me jump in here just for a second. I think Nick Sayers does a good job on talking about the work that Scrivener was commissioned to do in regard to his translation from the English to the Greek, and I think that's what it was. He was commissioned to find where the AV came from. What was the text that they used? And obviously what he found was that it was an eclectic text. He didn't back translate the English into the Greek to come up with his own TR. What he was commissioned to do was to actually to find what text they used when they translated the AV. And I think that's exactly what he did. And what he found was that it was in fact eclectic. It didn't come from any one source. But and Burgon obviously is used by proponents of the AV for a lot of different reasons, and he's not a TR advocate like TR advocates would be, like who's sitting here with Jonathan and myself, I think, but he does have a lot of good points on that, and obviously I want Jonathan to have the chance to respond to this since it's directed more towards him, but I had to throw in my 2 cents there. So, anyways, Jonathan, if you could.
My question is just because that's considered ecclesiastical. Burgon would be considered Jonathan's position to a level. They may differ on a few details, but they're on the same page as far as viewing the history of the text.
Yeah. So once again, the Church of England was front and center during this discussion in there. Burgon did say Scrivener was the best. Scrivener did a lot of great work. He knew all the issues. He was involved at the very front. It is fascinating that he does go ahead and do his addition. And, of all the collations he did and everything else, in some way, to me, he kind of backed the AV committee, which was trying to deal with this issue. Now, we all understand that there are issues that have to be resolved, that we're trying to resolve. But, the big issue in this case that we're trying to discuss is, yes, there's some textual variants that we want to resolve, and what's the best way to do it. But it starts with a foundational text that they'll say is not the Vulgate, the Byzantium, or the Peshitta, but it's these earlier editions that should be given much more weight and be used as the basis for our textual decisions. And that's really where the divide is. Because the question is, how do I undermine the textual scholarship of Cardinal Jimenez or Erasmus or the AV committee? And Hort understood that in order to unseat the Textus Receptus, what he had to do was attack the ecclesiastical text, because the TR is based on those editions. So if they move those off as hearsay witnesses, then you can bring in other witnesses as the basis for your text.
Okay.
I think I'll just say this, Josh, and I'll go. I just got one thing to say, and I'll let you bring somebody on. I think that what I'm hearing is that viewpoint over there has the same problem, though different maybe passages, that the critical text people do. The TR advocates or the founders of the text that is today, Erasmus struggled with Acts 8:37. He left an annotation on it. They all struggled. And Durgon at the very end of this, even Scribner doubted Matthew 16, 2 through 3, and places like that. I mean, Scribner didn't agree with all the readings he put in this text. The fact of the matter is they all struggled with authentic readings and which one should go, which one should stay, or should they be modified. It's not a new concept like, well, the TR's got it all figured out. The critical text people, they don't have a finalized text. If we're looking at the history of this has always been an issue in every camp on what do we do with these readings that are very questionable. That's the only point I'm trying to make, is that they struggle with readings just like the critical text people read. They struggle with readings today, too, as to which one's the best.
That'll work. Hey, thanks for calling in, Stephen, and if we can get something worked out between you and Jonathan, we need to see if we can do it. So, anyways.
Thanks, Josh.
Yep, bye. So, anyways, I've got another call coming in here. Let me see if I can get that on speaker.
I sent the caller's voicemail. Goodbye.
Oh, man, what happened? I didn't get to it quick enough. Whoever just called in, call back, please. I didn't get to the button quick enough. But, Jonathan, if you get a chance, how would you like to respond to that last point that Stephen made? Basically, it sounds like to me he's saying, you know what, you guys are doing the same exact thing we are, and we ultimately need an authority to tell us, like, what is and what isn't Scripture. I mean, we're using the same methodologies, we're using the same, we're ultimately trying to decide what is and what isn't authentic. And I think ultimately it comes down to what you're saying is we've got two completely different methodologies. But where do you go with that, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, I think it's important to note is, as Aaron, as Gurry, they put on, remember, the text of the Reformation, they were making these decisions based on this foundational text. So the issue that we're having today is that we're basically, I mean, as Gurry points out in his article, that, and he chides James, White, and Daniel, don't appeal to that evidence because we're not actually using it. So that's the problem. So we're basing these textual decisions on two different textual foundations. The Magisterial Reformation was using these ecclesiastical texts. What Gurry is saying in his article is we're not using those as the basis for our textual decisions. And we're not actually using the structure on what the church has said to how to evaluate that to make our decisions either. What we're using is another set of principles that we are coming up, such as the reading that best explains the others. The earliest is to be preferred. This is not the model that is being described by Tertullian, Irenaeus, Jerome, any of the textual editors into their process. So they're using a new set of principles. They're moving off a textual foundation
Here, let me put you on hold, and you'll have to turn
the
your volume.
reformers obviously had access to and were able to evaluate and did not use. And they're substituting the ecclesiastical text for a different text type. So as a result, you're going to get different editions.
On your computer down.
All right, I'm away from the phone.
Okay.
I got away from it. I'm somewhere else in the room.
Perfect. So, Jonathan, we've got another call that's come in. Is this? I think this is Gary, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So Gary's got a question for you, Jonathan, and I know that Sean Adams, you were trying to call in at the same exact time as Gary. So just give me a call back whenever I get off with Gary. And we'll get your question in. We're coming up on 2 hours here, so Jonathan, you can just let me know how many questions you want to take. I know we've got some that have come in in the written form as well.
Yeah.
So, anyways, Gary, whenever you are ready, just go ahead and throw your question or comment out there to him.
All right. Hey, Jonathan, I got a question for you. Have you ever heard of Michael Maynard that debated over 1 John 5 and 7 through 8?
Maynard, I think, I believe I have his book on 1 John 5:7 on that issue. But go ahead with your question. So I'm familiar with Maynard.
Yeah, because I have a 3-week binder on him. I got it from Gail Ripper's, where she writes her books at, and she sent me copies of this. And another thing, I've always heard about people, the King James translators depart from the TR several times, because James White's always bring up Revelation somewhere where the TR, the King James has it, but the TR doesn't. And I like to commentate, and I'll just get off and let other people talk to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gary. So I think he's probably making a reference to Revelation 16:5. I know James talks about a couple different places where he says that it's a conjectural emendation, that there's no Greek support for it. I think it may be where he talks about who is, who was, and who shall be. But that'd be it, more than going on a specific variant than that. I think it would be kind of the general concept of, are there variants that the King James strays away from the TR in places that it's not even a TR.
Well, I think what we have to understand about the TR is a text type. So there's different editions of the TR as a whole, because even when we look at the Byzantine text form, there's 7 different families within it. But when we look at the TR text type as a whole, which the King James is
I've got you on hold
an edition of
until
the
he's done with
there are
his
differences.
answer.
I think there's probably about 230 differences between the TR. So there are differences between the various TRs of Scrivener,
are you there?
Stephanus, Cardinal Jimenez, Erasmus, Theodore Bieza. They all produced editions of the TR,
hey, Sean,
which are based on those foundational ecclesiastical
he's done with
texts.
his answer.
So once again, now, obviously, as an Anglican, I naturally have my bias that my default position would be the scholarship of the AV committee. First, because they had over 100 years where a lot of scholarship was done for them. Plus, the Church of England had an immense number of scholars, such as Lancelot Andrews, that really understood the issue. They understood the polity of the apostolic churches, how they were set up, how they were transmitting the text, and what was being used in the churches. So in terms of scholarship, I understanding the ancient world, how the churches operated, evaluation of the evidence, I said they were in the best position to make those decisions as opposed to what we see happening today.
That's good. Okay, so we've got another call that has come in from Sean Adams. And Sean, you are on with Jonathan, so whenever you're ready, go ahead and ask me your question or put out a point of clarification.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. I'm the dead horse guy, by the way. And I want to clarify that real quick. I didn't mean it that it shouldn't be discussed. It's the same old information over and over. That's it. I mean, it's the early church father references for one side and no Greek manuscripts for the other side.
You know what's interesting about that? So Stephen Avery replied and said, no, there is some new Greek evidence that has come out in the last few months on that to support 1 John 5:7. I'd be really interested to see that. But maybe that's something new that you're looking for.
Yeah, maybe. And maybe you can do another couple hours on it. That'd be great. I'll listen.
Okay.
My quick question for Jonathan is, do you consider Codex Sinaiticus or Vaticanus God's Word?
Well, So here's the thing: when I'm evaluating Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, evaluating it on what it is. I don't know anything about the text. Now, I don't know who authored it, who created it. I don't know what group or produced that text. So I have no information to make that decision, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So, but what I would say, based on, is this the type of text that were actually used by the official churches of the apostles, that we can objectively compare? Because when they are Greek texts of the 4th century, and when I compare the text that is exhibited in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus against the Church of Antioch, the Church of Rome, and even in North Africa, it doesn't witness to that type of text. It's the same thing when Jerome looked at the Apocrypha and he went to the Jewish churches to do his translation and noticed that those documents were not received by the Jewish churches. The same thing with the longer reading in Daniel. He made an empirical observation that said that these aren't the type of texts that were handed on to the Jewish synagogues. And so when I look at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, I have no information to make that decision except the fact that those texts don't represent the type of text that is represented in the official churches of the apostle. So I would classify those texts as not having been received and therefore apocryphal. So we don't know where it comes from. All we know is it's not the type of text that were copied by the Greek Orthodox churches. So I'm going to have to make a decision to say, am I going to go with what was handed down to the official churches of the apostles or something that can't witness to that type of text? So that's where I say the word of God is what was handed down to the physical churches that can trace back to the apostles, not documents that we can't show that trace back to them.
All right, so I'll follow up.
Does that make sense?
I'm an Anglican guy. How were the translators to the King James Bible able to accept the Septuagint, errors and all, as God's word? Even because you just said that Jerome called into question the Apocrypha.
Yeah,
and translators accepted it as God's word.
Well, if you think about it, all the translators, they all had to sign the 39 Articles of Religion. And in that confession, and remember, every clergy member had to sign that. It specifically states that these are historical documents, but there's no basis for doctrine, and they're not considered canon. This is the same position that is classified by Athanasius and Jerome during their position. So we quote Jerome specifically in the 39 Articles of Religion. Now, we don't throw away the documents because they were received. And as regards to the Septuagint, the Jewish churches weren't just necessarily giving over their texts to the Greek churches at that time. So it was the means that God provided to have the Old Testament scriptures in the Greek church. And the King James translators, they obviously wanted to understand how they translated the Hebrew into Greek. So it was a really good understanding of how that was done. But now that we have the Hebrew text, we don't necessarily need to rely so heavily on the Septuagint. So there was a reason behind why the AV committee, the Greek Orthodox churches needed something because the Jewish churches weren't just handing over their texts. But now that we have the Hebrew text, the Septuagint definitely allows us to understand how it was translated from Hebrew into Greek to give the AV committee a better understanding of doing the translation. Does that make sense?
I understand but in the letter to the translators, they specifically state Jerome knew there were errors. He even sent it back out knowing it had errors to the people. And then the translators affirmed, even with the errors, it was the word of God. Nay, it is God's word, is the quote that they use.
That the Apostolic...
I'm trying to parse and understand how, if the translators can acknowledge a manuscript that has errors and is not necessarily perfect in every line and precept, but still contain God's word enough to send it out to the people for salvation and edification, then why can't we at least look at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus in a similar way? Errors, no errors, differences. There's more in common than there are differences.
Well, the Septuagint was received by the Greek Orthodox churches, so there's a difference there. The text of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus was not received. It can't be shown to be from any of the churches. So there's a big difference in the Septuagint was received by the Greek Orthodox churches. So there's a Vaticanus and Sinaiticus was not received. I mean, we're talking about the Word of God, and we want to, God tells us in the Bible to test the spirits, for they're not all of God. That would apply to the textual manuscripts. So that would also apply to say, there's more Gospels of Peter
I'm doing a podcast.
And more gospel publication. So should we accept those too?
Well,
I mean, why are we accepting
the early Greek church accepted the Apocalypse of Peter?
It's not from now. So remember, there's 50 or so gospels out there that are not in God. In Scripture, it gives us a definitive way to go ahead and test this against an empirical process to ensure what we received is from God. And so what we're saying is, on these particular cases with these documents, they can't show that they're actually from God's church. So in the same way that the Gnostics' texts were not received by these churches, any one church could be corrupted. But we're talking about thousands of churches that go back that don't witness to these particular texts. When we talk about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, we're talking about a different text that's not, illustrated. I mean, we're talking about a unit of measurement to evaluate the credibility of a document.
Buddy. I'm about done.
In normal course of law, we wouldn't just bring in whoever we wanted to say, oh, I have information on the crime. Well, were you there? I don't know. Did anyone speak to you from the scene? I don't know. You wouldn't bring those witnesses in, but we're saying we're going to bring these witnesses to determine the text of the New Testament.
Right. Okay. And I understand your line of thinking.
Because this is where it goes next.
With the Greek church succession and apostolic succession passing down the scriptures, and that's a consistent statement. But I think where it falls short is you're saying the Greek church was able to do that, but you would reject their doctrine and theology that they claim is passed down the same way.
Well, remember, our doctrine comes from the text. So there's obviously a number of differences in the East and West over theological or where they interpret it. The problem comes in is we're trying to establish
not the theology.
Yeah, so we're trying to establish. Our theology comes from the text. So we have to establish what is the text of the apostles first before we can establish the doctrines as the basis of that text.
Okay,
But
so
do you see that disconnect there? That if you're saying they were able to secure the scriptures and the manuscripts down through from Antioch down, but they were not able through those same means to convey the doctrine and theology passed on apostolically through one to the other from the apostles down through today. That seems like, how are they able to accomplish one and not the other?
Well, I think for the most part, they worked out a lot of issues. I mean, if you look at the ancient creeds, the Athanasian Creed, the Nicene Creed, they worked out a very similar confession of faith. Yeah, there was obviously differences that we have, but there's a general proclamation amongst the Greek Orthodox churches and here in the West of a common statement of faith that they all found. And when we talk about, the scriptures in every church, that's what we see. That's the one common thing that we find in all churches are these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 14 letters of Paul, and the other scriptures as well. Now, obviously, there's some differences, which shows that there was no collusion by the churches, but we can compare those to see where everything is correct or not. So the doctrine, there's a common statement of faith between the Greek and the West. Obviously, there's some differences, and we saw that in the first century with the churches of Corinth. The apostles were fighting amongst themselves. So what we see in scriptures is the same thing we see happening now as far as difference of opinion. But what we find in the text is we basically find the same text in these different churches.
hey, Sean, I appreciate. I'm going to say so.
Can I make one last point?
Yep.
Can I make one last point, John?
Yep.
Just one more follow-up question on the Peshitta. I mean, when you appeal to the Peshitta, we know like the first 600 years, it didn't have 5 books of the New Testament.
That's correct.
From the get-go, it's been a living, breathing, flowing, forming thing, but for some reason now we have to say it has to stop. And these new discoveries can't be brought into the equation.
Well, remember, the Aramaic churches are witnesses.
Hey, thanks for calling in, Sean. I'm gonna get off here. And my son is woke up and he's crying because he wants my phone. So, but anyways, I appreciate you calling in, dude. You're welcome on anytime, man. So, and then Jonathan, I'll turn it back to you. All right, thanks, Sean. Bye. All right, Jonathan, I want to turn it back to you. We're at 2 hours and 15 minutes right now, so it's up to you. I don't know how much longer you want to go, but I think if you wanted to wrap it up after you answered this question that he just asked you about the Peshitta, we could wrap it up and go on from there. I know we've got a lot more on our schedule that you had put together for the outline, but that's if we wanted to come back, we could always do a part 2 or something.
I go on. The thing you have to do.
I'm so I didn't. It cut out for a second there. What'd you say?
Oh, did you want to go on after this question, or it's up to you? How much time are you looking at?
Yeah, no, I think after this question, it'd probably be a good time to wrap up, and then if we wanted to do a part 2 sometime, we could see about scheduling that. But yeah, I mean, it's been good either way. So, come here, Cole.
Okay. Yeah, in reference to Peshitta, remember, they are one set of witnesses that do trace back. And obviously, we're going to look at their testimony. But the thing is, we also have Western churches that trace back, and we have Greek churches that trace back as well. And what we do find is all these other churches who can trace back to these apostles do come down with these records. So once again, it's never dependent on one witness. It's independent witnesses where they agree. And while the Peshitta was absent several books, now we don't know if they rejected them afterwards it wasn't received. What we do know is here in the West and in the Greek Orthodox churches, these documents were received throughout, and we can establish that they are both apostolic and Catholic when we look at where the independent witnesses do agree.
No, that's good. And Sean does a really good job of coming up with questions like that. And he and I have gone back and forth on some of those things, particularly with the Septuagint, in a number of different ways. And I really appreciate him asking those questions, as well as those of you who are asking questions as well. So, Jonathan, I'll leave it up to you. We've got one question that I think kind of ties in to what we were talking about today that may be a good one to get in. Okay, so let's do that one, and then we can wrap it up and go from there. This is from Matthew Murphy Rose. I'm going to put it up on the screen for those of you who are viewing to see. He says, where does Mr. Sheffield stand on other quote-unquote weakly attested passages contained within some TR traditions? Examples, Luke 2:22, Ephesians 3:9, Revelation 16:5. But specifically 1 John 5:7.
Okay, so let's because there's a lot of things we could discuss. Let's talk about 1 John 5:7 in particular when we have to weigh that evidence. Okay, so I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of allusions out there on those passages, and that's from Cyprian, Tertullian. We have a number of Greek fathers that supposedly allude to that scripture. So how do we evaluate that in the context of the evidence we have? Now, my position, obviously, against critical text proponents that reject 1 John 5:7 outright is, first, as we talked about before, they said that the Syrian Byzantine text form is secondary in origin, and it's the least valuable for recovering the original text. So the fact when they appeal to a text form that they said is not trustworthy, and that passage is basically not in the Syrian Byzantine text form, they're contradicting themselves, because you can't tell us on one hand that we can't trust the Syrian Byzantine text form as credible, and saying because it's not in there, we can't trust it. So that's first off. They already said that witness is not viable to make textual decisions off of. And here they're appealing to it that says 1 John 5:7 is not in there. Well, you just told us that text is corrupt. And if that text is corrupt, well, we can't establish any valid testimony on that. And because their major thing is, well, it's not in the majority of the Greek, so we can't accept it. But when we have cases such as without cause, the doxology, goodwill towards men, that are in the majority of the Greek manuscripts, but they're not in the Latin in this case, those they say the Latin is right. So I think their standpoint for how they argue it is very contradictory. So you're going to accept the Latin now, but not in these cases. So it's a very inconsistent methodology, and they basically don't like it, so they don't put it in. But when we look at the evidence, so let's look at the empirical data. First, we have allusions by Tertullian and Cyprian. And we know that at the council called by the Vandal king Hungarit in about 480, when when King Hungarit sent out a letter to all the Trinitarian bishops that said, go to Scripture, we're going to have a council, and we're going to discuss this issue with the Arians to determine what is scriptural or not. And that letter went out to all the Trinitarian bishops. They came to that council in 3 different languages with the confession that specifically cites 1 John 5:7 in it. They use that particular verse to argue for the defense of their Trinitarian position. So this has nothing to do with the King James people adding it in, as Daniel Wallace will say. King James people did not add it in. The churches of North Africa, which do go back and has authority in the ancient world, use this specific passage. The thing about that is it's used over in Spain, and we find this passage throughout the West. Now, the Church of North Africa, we're talking about the same textual line that Cyprian and Tertullian go back to. So it starts to wonder, they're using a quote that these two fathers are obviously alluding to. So, and they brought it to a council to defend the Trinitarian. So you have over 484 bishops at that particular council. Now, the other thing I want to mention is because there's a common claim out there that the earliest Vulgates didn't have it. Well, the problem with that is the Vulgate was in North Africa as early as 403 AD. We have this corroboration in Augustine addressing alone that they were able to view already in there from his controversy. Now we're talking about councils now 70. They were originally, the North African bishops were trying to Rome to come to, that the Vandal king was against, and there's an assumption that they did not have the Vulgate. Are you saying that it was already in North Africa, it was being read in the churches, that that the Bishop of Carthage didn't have a copy of the Vulgate 78 years after it was already in North Africa? This wouldn't be consistent with the evidence at all. We know it was already there in 403. They didn't have that. Is not being consistent with the evidence that's explained in Augustine's letters to Jerome, where it was throughout North Africa and they were reading it. The second thing we have to look at in this particular case is we understand that it's not in a lot of the Byzantium text form. Now, when this issue first comes up, and it does not come up until the Reformation, every magisterial reformer, when they reviewed the evidence on this scripture, with the exception of Luther, ruled in favor of this verse. And when the Greek church came together in 1904 to review the evidence as well, especially on this passage, their decision was to include it in, even though text critical proponents will say that it's not in the Greek text. Well, the official Greek Orthodox churches, those are actually the successors of the apostles, concluded that this passage is original to their passage, and they included it in. So when we talk about, there's a lot of history to this verse. We know it is the majority verse, at least in the Latin, and we understand there's a difficulty in the Greek text. But when the Greek church looked at this, they didn't have a problem, and they included it in. They discussed the issue, just as the magisterial reformers in, and they all concluded that it should be included into the text. So what we're having now is many text critical proponents that are not part of the official churches making a decision to take it out. So those are some of my quick thoughts on there. I know it's a lot.
No, dude, you're good. That was that's an in-depth, quick answer. Is about an in-depth answer as you can get in that short of a sound clip for supporting 1 John 5:7. And there's a lot of there's a lot of examples like that in some of the other variants that I can't remember his name that he listed in the question there. But anyways, Jonathan Sheffield, I really appreciate you coming on again. And guys, for those of you who have not seen his YouTube channel, go check it out. He has turned conversations like this into a cartoon format that he designs and does pretty much everything himself. But there's so much content in there that it's good, man. And I really appreciate you doing that. So keep them coming. But tell us, what is it that you're working on right now?
Right now, I'm actually working on a defense of the resurrection. Earlier in January, I had the opportunity to go up to the Atheist Experience, and I was sort of the pre-fight debate with Tom Jump in defending the resurrection. So I am putting out a video that goes over my opening argument, and I will actually be responding to a particular case that Dr. Richard Carrier cites against the resurrection, particularly the empty tomb. So hopefully I'm hoping to have that video out in the next 6 weeks or so. And I'll be doing more work going against some of the modern atheist arguments in attacking Christianity and the reliability of the New Testament text.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on today. And it seems like, if it's something that we can work out, we could do a part 2. Or I think the next thing is finding a way to get somebody to debate you. And I know that you had said before we went live that maybe there's a way that we can work out a format that'll work with you and James Snap. So we'll see what happens there. But anyways, thanks again for coming on, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh.
Awesome, man. We'll catch you later. And guys, stay with me for just a second. I'm going to cut to my closing scene and just kind of give you an update on what is coming up in the near future. Let me get the volume down there so it doesn't blow your ears out. But anyways, the camera is not where I want it to be. But anyways, so yeah, we are... what's coming around the corner is Tim Morton is going to be coming on. We're going to talk about ancient Near East cosmology. And so many people teach today that, like Michael Heiser would say, that the Old Testament ancient Near East cosmology teaches a flat Earth. And so stick with us on that. I'm not a flat earther. Tim Morton is not a flat earther. And we may be differing with Michael Heiser's interpretation on whether or not the Old Testament ancient Near East Israelite interpretation of the cosmology would be flat Earth. So stay tuned for that, but I'm also going to be debating Kenneth Joel on the Trinity. So I have a feeling that the relevance of today's conversation with 1 John 5:7 may be involved in that, but he is a Unitarian, so that should be an interesting conversation, and I believe one that's still worth fighting over and fighting for, just like the battle for the credibility and authenticity of the Bible that we have. So those are just some of the things that we've got coming down the pipeline. And obviously, we're going to be looking for a debate for Jonathan as well. So anyways, thanks again for tuning in, guys. Be sure and like this video, share it, and rate us if you're listening to it on a podcast. But I really appreciate you coming on and tuning in. So I hope you all are staying safe through these perilous times with the coronavirus. I know there's a lot of fear and anxiety over all of this. But just do your part to be smart and stay out of places that, obviously could be harmful to you and your family and other people as well. But guys, I've got to say, as a Christian, the one thing that we do have is a hope that is in us, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ. We have better things to look forward to and better things to hope in, and that is a presence with the Lord when this all ends. I mean, at the end of the day, guys, these are tough times we're going through, and people are looking for hope. People are looking for some sort of joy and happiness and some light at the end of the tunnel. So if you can offer that to them, that's a way to do it. But anyways, God bless and have a good evening. We'll talk to you soon.